Thank you so much for inviting me here. It's wonderful to be here with you all tonight and for the next days for the workshop. There's so many different possible talks that I could be giving today, but I'm going to focus it in on work that I've done that relates to genetic profiling. So it's going to be, in this sense, kind of a pretty focused tour through several different artworks that look at how we predict things about people from DNA and what some of the implications of that are, and then thinking also about the storage of DNA and cells and blood and things like this and what this all means. And this began, my kind of journey into this biotech world began around 2012 with the project Stranger Visions. And in this project, this started in a therapy session. So I was sitting here in therapy and I was looking at this print that was across from me on the wall above the therapeutic couch. And the glass covering the print was cracked and there was this hair stuck in the crack of the glass. And I sat there for the hour just staring at this hair and thinking about the person who had left it and imagining them, pondering about what I could learn about them from this hair and kind of having this forensic fantasy, you could say, and imagining myself taking this hair and taking it to a lab and learning all about this stranger. And when I left, I noticed that there were these kinds of genetic artifacts everywhere, so cigarette butts and chewed up gum and people clipping their nails on the subway and people brushing their hair and throwing it in the bathroom and things like this. So what I suddenly realized that we were leaving these traces of ourselves around all the time without giving it a second thought, and that anyone could come along and mine these for information. So anyone could take that hair and extract DNA from it and learn about the person who had left it. And this was increasingly becoming possible because DNA was easier and cheaper and faster to read and to analyze. And so I had this kind of imagining, and in the Project Stranger Visions, this is exactly what I did. So I went around New York City and I collected these things like you see in the picture. This is a picture from Penn Station, collecting hair from a trash can, chewed up gum and cigarette butts, and I started collecting these items. I brought them to GenSpace. I'll come back to that in a minute, but this was the world's first community biology lab. So that means the first space where anyone could go in and learn the basics of molecular biology in a hands-on way. And in Stranger Visions, I took these samples, I put that together with computer programming, prediction, I'll come to a bit more about that in a second, extracted the DNA, analyzed it, and used that to create possible predictive faces of people based on the DNA. And so these are full-color, life-size 3D prints depicting what an individual might look like based on their genetic information. And I looked at a variety of different traits, some of which are fairly well established, like eye color, that has a pretty strong predictive possibility, some which are much more contentious, like ancestry, and that's something that we'll talk a lot about in the workshop also, how these ideas of ancestry are created through genomic knowledge and kind of what some of the contingencies are around that. I looked at genes which are not usually considered controversial, but which I try to problematize also in some of my work, like looking at genetic sex. And preliminary studies of things like weight and freckling and facial shape. And I put all of these things together, created these portraits, and I exhibited these faces along with the sample that they were created from, along with the description of what was the genetic profile that I created of this person, and presented these in a way that I thought people could walk in and they could look at these faces and they could think, that could be me, that could be my DNA, and really create some kind of association with them, that they would feel represented in there, or that they would feel like implicated in this genetic process, and potentially be upset about it, not feeling necessarily happy that I was going out there and collecting potentially their DNA and looking at it without permission. And that was the idea behind the piece, really, was to get people thinking about these emerging issues of genetic privacy, and that it was increasingly possible for someone like me, who knew really nothing about molecular biology when I started, to take DNA and start to learn something about an individual based on this DNA. So I mentioned the lab. So this was GenSpace. This was the world's first community biology laboratory. It had opened up a couple years earlier in Brooklyn, so down the street basically from where I was living. And this lab, they allowed people to come in to take like a biohacker kind of boot camp is what they called it. So you would learn the basics over a few days of how to extract DNA, how to amplify it, how to analyze it, how to do some basic genetic engineering. And so I went through this course, I learned the basics of how to work with DNA, and then I started to work with the scientists who were running the lab and kind of worked under their mentorship to try to answer this question of how much could I really learn about a stranger from a hair or from a cigarette butt. And a journalist just asked me earlier, what is actually the answer to this question of how much can you learn about a stranger from a hair? And I think this was nice to ask that. And I think basically the answer is that you can make guesses about someone, but it's very hard to tell anything with certainty. So you can make some maybe even strong predictions, like I mentioned, for example, about eye color. You can learn clues, for example, about their ancestry, but it's very difficult to say with certainty anything about what someone looks like, what they behave like, what their disease risks might be. It's always a more complex story. So the lab work that was happening in GenSpace, so I put that together with skills that I had already developed over 10 years of earlier work doing art and artificial intelligence. So I'd been working for a long time looking at surveillance systems. I was interested in things like facial recognition and how those were increasingly being deployed on streets. And I knew that you could take, for example, like a facial recognition system, like a neural network, and one that is used for recognizing faces, and that you could twist that around, that you could kind of manipulate that to turn it into a face-generating system. And so I was interested in taking these systems that were used for other forms of surveillance and kind of turning them around and using them for this purpose of generating faces. And so this is what I did in Stranger Vision. So I took this 3D facial recognition system. I connected that with the profile that I was developing in the lab and wrote a little bit of code basically to connect these two things. And so then you could take a genetic profile and use that to connect with a 3D model of a face and generate these different possible faces based on this genetic profile. And so again, my interest here really was in confronting people with this risk of their genetic data, that they would be shedding, these pieces of themselves, that this could happen without their knowing, that there were different potential risks coming with this that we were not thinking about, that we were not talking about. And so I wanted to confront people with this and make them think about the surveillance and the privacy aspects, and also to point out that there was this new technology being developed called DNA phenotyping. And that is this attempt to predict a face from DNA alone. And so I knew this is something that would be coming to policing, for example, and I wanted to put that out there that people become aware, like this is a new tool that's coming down the pipe. But I thought that that was about like 10 years in the future. And then, just a couple years later, after I worked on Stranger Visions, a friend's mother sent me this clipping from her local newspaper. This is a DNA mugshot. So a company had opened and started selling this service to police, selling these predictions of what someone looks like, of what a criminal suspect would look like based on their DNA. And I knew from having just done extensive research into this, talking with scientists, reading all the articles, I knew that this was still basically the stuff of science fiction, that this was a bit speculative still. And if I was generating, for example, 7 different portraits of a person based on their DNA, and then subjectively choosing one that made me feel something, choosing one that reminded me of someone. What would the police be doing in this situation? So I became increasingly concerned when I saw that this had moved so quickly from like a speculative future into a problematic present. And I started thinking, how can I problematize this? How can I get people thinking more critically about this? So I started to give talks and to write articles and to bring people into a critical discussion in that way. But I wanted to bring it together with the artistic work as well. And so remember, I've been putting these, in the exhibit so far has been like one portrait of a face, one sample, one genetic profile. So presenting the risks, but not presenting any kind of nuance, not presenting any complexity of interpretation. And so I started thinking, how can I bring this complexity into the artwork as well? And then in 2015, I received this email. So Paper Magazine was conducting an interview with Chelsea Manning. So Chelsea Manning was the US whistleblower who made WikiLeaks a household name, for those of you who remember that, calling attention to the prevalence of civilian deaths and torture in the Afghanistan and Iraq wars. And she was sentenced to 30 years in a military prison. At the time of her sentencing, she announced her gender transition female. And this was also a moment when her image became completely suppressed from the public. So no one had actually seen Chelsea Manning as she identified. And Paper Magazine contacted me. They said, we're doing an interview with Chelsea Manning through the mail, and we want to have some kind of picture to accompany it. Would you be interested? We started corresponding, Chelsea and I. Chelsea had seen my work. She was interested in this kind of DNA predictive technology, but we wanted to make like a small twist on that. So we wanted to start to challenge some of these reductions in the genetic prediction. And in particular, to use this technology to highlight the reduction around genetic sex as the starting point. So to question, can you really predict someone's sex or gender from their DNA? So the next time that Chelsea Manning was getting a haircut, she swept up some of the clippings. This was at the time they were forcing her to basically have a buzz cut all of the time in prison. So she swept up some of the hair, also took a couple Q-tips and swabbed the inside of her cheeks, and then mailed those to me from the prison. And I extracted the DNA, and I walked through the same kinds of processes that I walked through in Stranger Visions, with the one difference that we had decided in advance to leave the genetic sex profiling part out of the analysis. And so I didn't look at her genetic sex. And the idea here was to present two portraits. So this is the beginning of unfolding the interpretive space of the genetic profile. So two versions of her portrait that we presented. One that is gender neutral, that you see on your left, and one that is parameterized female. So in this morphable model, in this 3D model that I was appropriating and using for generating faces, it's as if you would have a slider in this computer model, and the slider would say, this is a more female face, and this is a more male face. And so the more female face is on the right, and the supposedly neutral face is on the left. And so we wanted to present these both to challenge this genetic sex reductionism, and also just to put out this representation to really question would it even mean to have a female face? You know, to really question this assumption that is built into these computer models that we see increasingly across AI, across facial recognition technologies, these reductions, these stereotypes around what makes a face. And so this was our first experiment in that, of putting these two faces side by side, challenging these stereotypes. And remember, Chelsea's sitting in a military prison all of this time. Nobody can visit her, nobody can photograph her, nobody can see her. And these 3D prints premiered at the World Economic Forum in 2016, January of 2016. And this gave Chelsea Manning this very, very public face at one of the most elite political events of the year. And I think this was a very meaningful thing for us to be able to really intervene in that space and put her out there and say, this is someone who's been forgotten about, who's been locked away in prison, and you've thrown away the key, and we want to take her face and put it in front of you. So the story doesn't end there. So in November of 2016, as President Obama was leaving the White House, there was a campaign for Chelsea Manning's clemency. So I participated in some of this activism around advocating for her release from prison. And as part of that, we worked on this comic book together. And so this was called Suppressed Images. We wrote this together through the mail. So basically, Chelsea and I would mail our writing back and forth. And the comic book is really based also on our exchanges. So we had started exchanging letters and messages. And so here you can see the images and the text of the comic book describe the process of our collaboration together. And then it ends with this speculative last page. So on the last page, we imagine that President Obama commutes her sentence and that she's freed and that she's able to come and visit an exhibition of her portraits in person for the first time. And we were thinking about this as this like speculative imaginary, willing the future that you want to see, using kind of a speculative design twist on an otherwise documentary graphic novel kind of format. But we published it on the morning of January 17th, 2017, and that afternoon it actually came true. And this is really one of the most amazing days of my entire artistic career, that we put this out there, and it was like magic. And of course it wasn't magic, because it was a big campaign and a lot of activist effort that went into advocating for Chelsea's release from prison. But still, it was this stunning moment for me to have worked on this with her and then hear the announcement that she would actually be freed. And here she is. And here she is actually coming to an exhibit of portraits that we worked on together in person for the first time. So I feel like this is just something I want to just dwell on for a moment there, that art can have this incredible potential to really make change, or to really invite people into something truly political and transformative. So in 2017, we were offered this opportunity to have an exhibition together at a gallery in New York City, and we started corresponding then. What would be an interesting next step of our collaboration? We had created these 2 portraits. How could we take that further? And we started talking about all the other layers of reductionism that come into the DNA phenotype, into the genetic profile. And you can already get a sense here of what we did. We decided to radically push that further, to show many, many, many more interpretations of Chelsea from her DNA. So here you can see in the piece, Probably Chelsea from 2017. These are 30 different variations of Chelsea Manning's face based on the same DNA data. So they are suspended here at a range of different human heights in the gallery, and this installation format represented for me the crowd that had stood with her. So it's like a mass movement. It's like trying to show this almost like mass movement of Chelsea standing here in the gallery. And we hoped that you could see that genomic data can tell a multitude of different stories about who and what we are, and all of the different ways that your DNA can be interpreted, and how subjective that act of reading DNA really is. And DNA is just one type of data, right? This is the same for all data. It's like the same with our data trails that we leave online, and the information that we have on social media or on Google or things like this, right? DNA is just one other form of that data, and you can always take that data and you can read into it and you can interpret things and you can make predictions about people. But there's so many different ways that you can tell that story. There's so many different possible faces that could represent Chelsea, and so these are 30 of them. So a few years earlier, I had stumbled upon a host of different websites where I learned that you could purchase human biological materials, fluids, things like what you see here. This is saliva, but actually you could purchase just about any kind of fluid that you could imagine, or any kind of cells or tissue from the human body. And I really couldn't believe it at the time that you could go on and you could buy, single donor saliva, for example. But I kind of tucked that away for a future project as I was thinking about it. And then after working with Chelsea Manning, I started to think about this transition from having worked in Stranger Visions, where I had worked on multiple different strangers' DNA all at the same time. But suddenly with Chelsea, I was spending all of this time thinking about one person. And the interesting thing that happened with Chelsea was that I really got to know her first through her DNA. So before we got to know each other really by writing letters and things like that, I had been combing through her genetic data and thinking about her and predicting things about her and getting to know her in this way. And I started to think that DNA had this kind of potential for a strange kind of intimacy, that you could feel very close to someone through their DNA without them knowing, or without them really participating in that relationship. So it had this almost kind of stalker quality as well. And so I started thinking about this kind of strange intimacy, and then thinking about these websites where you could buy human samples. And I started researching DNA commodification and thinking a lot about where are these samples coming from, what are the processes that are leading to people selling their saliva, selling their cells, basically. And that turned into a whole giant research project, but it was too much for one art project. So I decided to kind of trace one particular path through this. And thinking about this relationship with Chelsea Manning, I started to develop the project T3511, or started writing a narrative that would become the film T3511. And so this film it's a 4-channel video narrative about a biohacker who falls in love with an anonymous saliva donor. So it really picks up from this, vial of saliva that I purchased off the internet. And then it traces this story of taking this saliva and sending it to 23andMe, getting back a genetic profile, thinking about the person, imagining them, coming up with ideas about what they might be like. But then it evolves, and you can watch it. It's on my website. You can watch the film for free. It's 9 minutes long. It unfolds over the course of that video until you see me actually tracking the person down. And this was something that I had, in doing this research, something that I had learned was that you could, for example, predict someone's last name from their DNA. So there were increasingly methods to do this, what's called surname inference from DNA. And just a whole melange of different techniques that you could use to go beyond just predicting what someone might look like to really being able to track them down. And so T3511 predicts that and kind of shows what that process might look like. And it predicted this, what became then another forensic method that is a genetic genealogy method that became also then used by police. Famously, there was a case called the Golden State Killer case in the United States where the police took a sample from, a surreptitious DNA sample from a suspect, and then extracted DNA from that and put that in one of these public recreational DNA databases and used that to find someone's relatives, to basically track down the suspect's relatives and see who it was. And ultimately they did solve that particular case, but it does also point towards a growing surveillance kind of system where people who had used these websites to, for example, connect with lost family members to try to find something out about their own identity through their DNA, suddenly they had created this informal police database without anyone ever asking for their permission. So T3511 kind of forecasted that process. And it was presented as a 4-channel video installation. And what you see here are 2 images from a biobank. I'll come back to the biobank in a minute. But I wanted to create this feeling of being inside of a biobank to really make you think that we are all implicated in this, that we are actually all in a biobank somewhere, that we've had blood drawn, or we've had a biopsy, or we've had some kind of medical tests, and we are all sitting in a freezer somewhere without really thinking about it or knowing it, and our data can be used for research or could be bought and sold without anyone actually asking us. So that is going to connect to the last project that I'll share, but just to finish this, I'll play you a very short excerpt from the introduction to T3511.
A cell is a history. A cell is a home. A cell is a hole. A cell is a cage. A cell is an electric fence, enclosing your legible unknown. To break the cell is to trespass the most intimate of spaces. Dear donor T2305, I received 5 milliliters of your saliva in June. It wasn't hard to get. Using my academic email and mailing address, I simply said it was for research, genetic testing, the truth. When it arrived, I moved it quickly to the freezer to keep it fresh and alive. I sent 2 milliliters of your fluid for sequencing, and then I waited and waited and waited. 6 weeks came and went, and then another time over. The company was experiencing unusually long processing times. When the results finally trickled in 6 months later, I devoured your profile in a single sitting. You are 46 years old with dark brown eyes, a full head of brown hair, and few freckles. You toss and turn in bed, and you enjoy a savory midnight snack. You like to run, for miles, for hours, and this keeps you slim, keeps your heart beating strong, and helps tame your sometimes wild thoughts. You were my first, and I think of you frequently. I imagine your face, your voice, the way you walk. I'm curious where you grew up. I worry for your health, and I wonder what you would think of me poring over your genetic details. I'd like to think you would be flattered, but you might be very angry.
I love these surveillance views from inside the biobank where you can really, so thinking about this, all of this work somehow having to do with surveillance and watching and observing, and then there's actually these cameras inside the biobank where the operator can control the robot that moves through the freezer. And so this image that you see here that's also in the film T3511, this is an actual biobank that I was allowed to film in. This is the National Biobank of Denmark. And so this freezer contains blood from every baby born in Denmark since 1982. And this is really remarkable that they allowed me in there to film. It's very hard to get access to these spaces. But in Denmark, they have a very open idea about privacy, about like medical, health, genetic privacy. And so they invited me in because it was part of a general kind of cultural openness around this medical information, really. And so in Denmark, very unusual among countries that I've researched, that you have the blood, so you have a blood spot from every baby, and this is also tied with like a national health record, with your medical records, with all of the kinds of tests that you might have undergone. So it's an incredibly comprehensive record of the population. And this varies tremendously country to country, and we can definitely talk more about that in the Q&A. I don't actually know how the situation is here in Argentina, but it would be very interesting if anyone does know how the system is here. But most countries in the world do some kind of newborn testing. So when a baby's born, they have their heel pricked, the blood's taken, and then you look to see are there any diseases that need to be addressed early on to help really save the child. It's important medical work. But then the question is, what happens with the blood afterward? And that is governed in really different ways in different parts of the world. In the United States, for example, this is it's on a state-by-state basis, so different states will keep the blood for different lengths of time. Some, will destroy it after a while. Some will keep it indefinitely. Some will give that data. So in Texas, for example, this biological trove of data was given to the Department of Defense for experimentation purposes. There was another case in New Jersey where the police were given access to this biobank of information. And so there's just, it's like a huge kind of potential lurking in these freezers that, again, people aren't really thinking about or talking about. So when you go in and get a medical test or get your blood drawn, right, you're not necessarily thinking about what's the afterlife of that sample or of that data. So I found this whole experience of going to the biobank really interesting, really inspiring, and from that moment I wanted to create some kind of immersive installation that would get people into thinking about being in these freezers, like I mentioned, so the video piece gets at that. But I also had in the back of my mind, I'd really love to make that even more physical. And maybe like a year and a half ago, I was contacted by the Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York about an upcoming show that was on the theme of home. Like, what does home mean to you as an artist? And I thought this would be kind of interesting to play on this idea of home and think about the biobank as a home for your cells, and think about, well, how at home are you with what's happening with your cells, with your data? And so for this exhibition, I created a kind of labyrinth-like structure that created the feeling of being in the biobank. So it's shelves and shelves of blood samples in the gallery. So you walk in, and you can hear now also the audio from the biobank. So these were recordings that I made at the biobank in Denmark. And so you walk in, and you're kind of like folded into all of these different blood samples, and each of these samples also has a QR code associated with it. And there's 7,000 vials of blood in the installation. And for me, this represents how each of us are in a biobank somewhere, from being tested at birth, from having these medical tests, from having biopsies, from having surgery, whatever might be in your medical history, and that we're not thinking about what's happening with these cells and with these samples. So part of the project, this project is called Is a Biobank a Home? So part of this project was thinking about this storage of blood and bringing us into thinking about how we relate to it. But another part of it was also very personal. So another part of it was about me actually trying to track down what's happened with my own cells, what's happened with my blood samples, what's happened with my DNA, what's happened with my biopsies, and writing to medical institutions that I had been treated at and asking these questions. And so as I am trying to track down my own data and my own cells, I start saving this correspondence. And basically this correspondence is very formulaic. We don't have to give you that information. Thank you so much for writing to us. We definitely protect your privacy, and we don't have to share that information with you. But please know that we respect your privacy. And so I start documenting all of these correspondences. And one thing that did come out of that process was that I was able to obtain slides of my own, of my biopsies, basically. And so what you see here is a stained glass window with slides embedded in it that contain, slices from my own tissue, from my body. Here's a close-up image of that. And so I worked with a stained glass fabricator to turn these slides into a stained glass window that's situated in the installation. And then this whole thing gets put together with the correspondence. So I worked with a composer, then I created a libretto from the letters, the emails that I was exchanging, trying to track down my data, trying to track down my cells. And then, so I wrote this libretto from that, and then I worked with a composer to turn this into what I called the correspondence song. And I think maybe it would be nice to just end. This is just it's a 5-minute piece of music. It's a short piece. So maybe I'll just end the talk by playing this song for you. And so you can listen, and while you're listening, listen for my name, listen for the exchange, basically, so what you'll hear first is me writing and me writing and me writing, and then finally you'll start to hear back at the end from the medical institutions.
Dear Director Bixler, I was born in Philadelphia, at Pennsylvania Hospital in 1982. Would it be possible for me to obtain my records? Dear Compliance Office, Privacy Office, I am a patient of Cornell. I have read the privacy policy and would like to become aware that my information has been shared in the last 6 years. Whom it has been shared with and why. Compliance Office, I am a patient. I am a patient. I would like to be informed if it was shared, etc. Dear Compliance Office, I never received a response. Dear Privacy Office, dear Privacy Office, I never received a response. I would like to request an accounting of what research use has been made of my data. I would also like to know what third parties have accessed my de-identified data. Dear Miss Dewey-Hagborg, dear Miss Dewey-Hagborg, dear Privacy Office, contacting compliance. Thank you for contacting. Provide you Thank you. Privacy. Thank you for contacting. Neither New York nor federal nor the state health information network require us to account for uses and/or disclosures of de-identified information. Dear Miss Dewey-Hagborg, thank you for reaching out for an accounting of disclosures.
Neither New York nor federal law nor the statewide health information network require us to account for uses and/or disclosures of de-identified information. Thank you for reaching out. Unfortunately, we are not able to provide you with such information. Please be assured that we value our patients' privacy.
So, thank you. So I don't know how we do the questions, but I'll put this headset on so I can hear any questions in Spanish. And I don't know if is someone going to facilitate questions or do I just look?
Hola, ¿qué tal? Gracias por la charla. Pensando en tu trabajo, se me vino la idea a la cabeza de esta dualidad que existe entre el concepto de qué es lo que viene como información con el nacimiento, con la naturaleza, y qué viene de las experiencias de vida, ¿no? El nurture versus nature. ¿De qué manera reflexionaste vos o de qué manera reflexiona la gente que ve tu obra sobre esta dualidad y cómo eso juega también un papel en lo que haces?
Yeah, so I think that this tension around nature and nurture, thinking about what is actually written in the DNA and how we take that as something determinate. You know, this is something that I'm very interested in putting out there, about trying to get people thinking about, trying to challenge. My own view on that is basically that we are very much products of our experience, and I think that most scientists now also would say that the genetics is just, you know, maybe like 1/3 of what makes us into the people that we are. And so nonetheless, we tend to give DNA so much weight and we tend to give it so much authority. And so I hope that my work kind of tries to get people thinking about that and to complicate the stories a bit. In terms of how people react to it, I guess it's a bit like what Yvonne was saying, you know, that it has this like, oh, is it creepy? Is it cool? Like, what is really going on with this? It's kind of surprising, but it's hopefully also interesting. Hopefully it gets you thinking about the issues that are there. And so sometimes I think people are kind of angry about, you know, about the work, especially I guess all of the works that I shared with you today, pretty much in one way or another, someone is angry about one of these works. So whether it's because I work with a whistleblower or because I'm, you know, doing questionable things with people's genetic data, or creating this like room full of blood, that is a very uncomfortable experience also for a lot of people. So yeah, I think that the works generally, I try to make a big impact with them. You know, I try to create something visceral so that people walk in and they really feel something when they see the work, so that it has this intellectual component, you know, it's conceptual, it has political stuff, but I hope it also has like a very visceral feeling.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Have you thought of introducing in your prediction or your visions some environmental variables like the weather, the feeding, exercise, love, or whatever, and how they could, I mean, it's clear that this it's speculative, but how that could affect your predictions?
So introducing environmental aspects in the sense of like from someone's experience, you mean? I think this would be very interesting. So in the workshop that we do, we're going to be learning also about epigenomics, and how the experience of an organism, how that modifies the expression of DNA. So I think this will be very interesting. It's actually something I've wanted for a long time to learn more about myself and to try to bring into my work. And so I'm excited to be looking at that tomorrow. And generally, the next kind of pieces that I'm working on in this vein are looking at the prediction of behavior. And I think absolutely that it would be very interesting to try to bring more kind of like clues into these predictive profiles.
Bueno, a mí me interesó la diferencia entre... A ver, espera que me lo anote. Me interesó la experiencia de que vos tomes una persona trans, justamente, y la relación entre... la diferenciación entre identidad, dato e imagen. Porque frente al predictivismo del ADN pensaba en el nomadismo de género, pero en el nomadismo de la identidad. No creo que en el momento de mayor acercamiento que hay de el condicionamiento aparentemente científico de la identidad, también es el momento de mayor inversamente proporcional nomadismo de la identidad, ¿no? Digo, en este tema del cambio que vos mostrabas al comienzo de Chelsea, ¿no? Justamente en el momento más que es encarcelada. También hay otro ejemplo de Lori Anderson, que fue interesante cuando vino a la Argentina para la Bienal de Performance, que ella también trabajó con gente encarcelada generando avatares por fuera, ¿no? Como si pudieran estar por fuera también, que ve. Y también pensaba el tema del registro de identidad de la voz. Vos dijiste que estabas cantando justo. Nada, pensaba en este tema de los levels entre los nomadismos de identidad, cambios de identidad, transicionalidad y determinismos de codificación de registro que sea visual, sanguíneo, sonoro, ¿no? Estaba pensando en eso. ¿Qué es lo que a vos más te provocó tomar ese primer ejemplo como, además de obviamente la carga política que eso generó y felicitaciones realmente porque debe haber sido muy duro el trayecto de poder sacar adelante algo tan fuerte, ¿no? Que en la Argentina te entendemos porque nosotros tenemos acá, estamos en un momento donde post dictadura estamos tratando también de preservar esta búsqueda de la identidad, ¿no? A través de las Madres de Plaza de Mayo.
Yes, that's very interesting, and I would be really interested to learn more and hear more from you all as well about your impressions and wishes or hopes in regards to these DNA identities. I think that maybe the question there was about why I decided to take this like genetic sex as a place to challenge the assumption of identity, and that was really serendipitous. I mean, it really came because I was increasingly uncomfortable with having put out this work that was so like reductionist, that was so in a way simplistic. It was very effective. So the Stranger Visions project, it was very effective at stirring things up, at generating media attention. There's so many, I was like always talking with journalists and things, and so it was very effective at bringing up these risks around surveillance and privacy. That worked great. But then I was really worried, that I'm contributing to some kind of reductionist idea that DNA that it creates a great predictive potential for us, that DNA can show exactly what we look like, for example. And so I really was trying to think, how can I create a work that will be as strong as the first work, but complicate the story? And so it was really just going with what happened. I mean, that I started writing about it, I started researching, you know, what are the complications here, what's the science behind it, you know, what can I say to challenge this that is as based in science as anything else, you know, not just based in ethics or philosophy or social science, but also really grounded in the science itself. And then, of course, I'd been following what was happening with Chelsea Manning, but I didn't have a direct connection to her until this request came through for the interview. And then I thought this could be a really interesting first step at making a more complex picture, basically, at presenting that to a public in a way that will feel as meaningful and intentional and strong as the original Stranger Visions piece. So that's, at least I hope, how it comes through, and that you can see also that it's like I'm also reflecting on and like critiquing or thinking through my own work, you know, that you see this process unfold of reflection.
Yo quería preguntarte, trabajando con genética y habiendo trabajado en un laboratorio de biohacking, ¿qué pensás de las herramientas de edición genética, por ejemplo como CRISPR, que están en etapas de research y tienen resultados tan polémicos y usos, y si lo tratás en alguna de tus obras?
I do, and there's another presentation where I would talk about that. It's always so hard to choose, you know, which projects to share. So there's another project that I premiered really recently, I mean, just last year, that's called Xeno in Vivo, and this is an opera that's about gene-edited pigs. So it's about pigs that are genetically engineered to have human-compatible organs. This is a process called xenotransplantation. It's something that has been, that scientists have been striving for decades to be able to basically harvest organs from animals and transplant them into humans. And so there's a whole long story around that. But basically, this opera piece, Xeno in Vivo, this looks at this long history of human intervention in animal genomes, thinking about domestication, thinking about agriculture, and then brings it up to the contemporary and looks at what's happening with gene editing, with CRISPR, and these efforts to make animals more human, and kind of tries to pose the philosophical questions there about what does that mean for, like, at what point does it become a different species, for example? You know, what does it mean for how we think about being human when we become these chimeric entities? And then I also have like these future pigs that I imagine, you know, what other ways might we edit animals in the future that are more fanciful or imaginative than simply harvesting their organs. And so that was it's a piece that is directly about gene editing, and it's something that I find fascinating and really interesting to think about how the potential of that will change our ideas of our own identities, you know, what we think is fixed about ourselves and what is mutable. This will really shift. We've seen how gene editing medicine has started to have some success, and so you can really imagine that there's a lot that you could change about yourself via gene editing. And so yeah, so I think that this is a really interesting area to explore, and for artists to engage more in the kind of cultural imagination around what is possible.
Gracias.
Cuando vos te encontrás con Chelsea y se genera esa comunicación, esa magia, ese encuentro, como cuando un pintor le regala o le entrega el retrato a su modelo, ¿no? O sea, de alguna manera hay ahí ese amor, esa entrega, y de parte de ella también, imagino, esa sensación especial de verse ahí, ¿no? Me pregunto, desde ya que es contrafáctico, pero ¿hay algo que le agrega el hecho de que vos hayas hecho su trabajo con materia viva, de alguna manera? Porque podría haber sido una obra pintada y la magia tal vez hubiera sido la misma en relación a lo que vos experimentaste y ella experimentó en relación a esa obra. ¿Qué sentís que le agrega a la obra esto de trabajar con la materia viva y la materia viva de tu modelo, ¿no?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I haven't thought about the piece in that way. It would be very interesting also what Chelsea would think of that. I think what we were thinking about was mostly this like idea of taking this tool, like this phenotyping tool that can be so oppressive in the hands of the police, and turning that into something that was liberatory, that was like smuggling her out of the prison in this way, taking this like surveillance tool. You know, she had been working as a data analyst when she was in the military, and so it was very fitting to have this like data analysis kind of portrait. So mainly I think we were thinking about these kind of conceptual layers. And yeah, so I think I would have to think more about that. Like, what does the livingness, you know, the living tissue kind of aspect of it, what does that mean? So I'd have to think about that a little bit more.
Thank you.
Segunda pregunta, ahora en castellano. ¿Alguna vez te preguntaste si alguno de los sujetos de los cuales colectaste muestras en lugares públicos, si había hecho algún perfil genético y lo podías identificar en 23andMe o cualquiera de esos bases de datos? Y si lo pensaste, ¿crees que puede ser un problema que reclamen derechos sobre la obra?
Yeah, good question. I mean, that would be an interesting twist. I think that would be in a way welcome, because everything that comes out of the regulatory questions around DNA is of interest to me. So the question of, you know, am I allowed to do what I did in the first place? This is a very interesting question. You know, what rights do we have to our shed DNA information? So that's probably different also, you know, all over the world. I know that it is also different state to state in the United States. And generally speaking, in most of my research, you know, once we shed some kind of genetic material, it's usually considered that we've given up our rights to it. Like, it's like abandoned. But again, this might be different in different places. So I think it's a very interesting question, and I would welcome anyone who wanted to kind of explore that.
Una rápida. ¿Le darías tu información genética a una empresa como 23andMe o a cualquier otra empresa? Digamos, por defecto.
I did. I'm usually my own first research subject in that sense. So, while I have a lot of concerns about the privacy, I also have so much curiosity, and so these things are always kind of pushing and pulling. But I did 23andMe, you know, ages ago, and when they went bankrupt most recently, I decided not to take my data out. So whereas basically all of my friends and family, you know, went through then the checkbox and said delete my data, delete my sample, or you know, destroy my sample. I decided to leave it there because I am still interested in seeing what's going to happen, and I kind of use myself as an experiment in tracking those things down. So I don't suggest anyone else do that, but I like to experiment on myself, I guess you could say.
Hola, yo quería consultarte qué reflexión o qué valor considerás que adquiere tu obra en un contexto internacional de avance de los extremismos, de la extrema derecha particularmente, y de las sociedades de control, digamos. Esa es como la primera pregunta. Y la segunda pregunta es, ¿qué lugar tiene el humor y el sarcasmo en tu obra? Porque, por ejemplo, en la canción, en la última canción, te veía reírte, y te veía reírte mientras yo también me reía, Y pensaba que para un público que no es especializado, ir a una galería de arte y encontrarse con un gabinete lleno de sangre también puede tener un efecto por ese lado, digamos. Y quería saber si además de lo visual, de lo conceptual, también había ahí una cuota de buscar la reflexión y la crítica a través del humor, digamos, no solo desde el impacto.
Yes, definitely. I like dark humor and I like absurdity and I like, you know, there's this way that when we're uncomfortable with things, we make jokes about them. And so I like playing with that a little bit in the work also. So that's definitely there. It's just something that I enjoy and it's part of how I deal with uncomfortable situations. So the thing about the global rise of fascism, you could say, so it becomes more important than ever to think about these risks of genetic profiling. And you know, we're looking at work that was made so long ago, really, if we think politically. You know, so much has changed since 2012. And so it would really be worth it to take like a pause now and think about making a new work that would directly bring up some of the risks that we're seeing right now around like inscribing identities into populations and the potential use of these predictions to control people's paths, to control their citizenship or, let's say, residency or deportation status, things like this. So I think that there's a lot that needs to be talked about around that, and that could be done with artistic practice as well to bring out these sort of eugenics type of risks. I think it's very interesting, and I've been having multiple conversations with journalists since I came here, and these questions keep coming up in the conversation. And so I think Argentina is maybe the place to have these conversations, or to do a new project, maybe like making this more directly present and clear. But yeah, basically I think the risks just are becoming more and more clear, more you could say existential, in that, like, really implicating people's lives in the surveillance and the ways that we read and predict like racial and ethnic and migration backgrounds and things like this from people's DNA and from more generally from their bodies.
Sí, bueno, yo tengo, perdón, la siguiente pregunta sería en relación a la reflexión sobre la propia práctica desde el biohacking y activismo. ¿Qué distinción u observación podrías hacer entre espacios comunitarios como Gene Space, que son espacios cuidados, y otro tipo de iniciativas como por ejemplo la de Josiah Sainer, Odin, que de alguna manera distribuye kits para hacer la propia edición genética, DIY, digamos, hazlo tú mismo, de manera particular, ¿no? ¿Qué potencia, qué cuidados o qué reflexión te merece esa posibilidad, ¿no?, de hacer una ciencia ciudadana de alguna forma, o prácticas activistas o de biohacking en estas plataformas que son diferentes? Una cosa es un espacio cuidado y otra cosa es la distribución y el experimento particular, ¿no?
I don't know if I know exactly the kit that you mentioned, so I might need to hear more about it, but in general I'm guessing it's like a kit to do gene editing at home, maybe on some bacteria or something like this. These have become more widely available. I tend really to be less worried about people doing stuff at home and more to think that it's great that people get to understand the medium. Because mostly, you know, we read about these things in the news, we read science journalism that's such a brief articulation of the complexities that are involved in doing biotechnology. And once you're in the lab and you perform an experiment yourself, it just changes how you can think about what it means. You know, it changes immediately, I think, what you think the truth power is of that experiment itself, or what the potentials of that are, or what the risks of that are. And I tend to think that there's no better way to learn those things than to actually do it in a hands-on way. So I'm probably like more of a strong proponent of people doing DIY, do-it-yourself experimentation, even if that means that they are doing it at home and not in a community lab. I do think the community lab is the best place for doing that because you have mentorship there, there's oversight, you know, of some degree going on. But ultimately, you know, I've thought about this a lot with Stranger Visions, you know, thinking about, well, what do we do about the privacy risk here actually? And I've come up with different ideas around that, like this kind of funny product called Invisible that would erase and replace your DNA, for example. But at the end of the day, there's really no way that you're going to prevent people from, if they're determined enough, from analyzing DNA, from editing DNA. I mean, it is just, this stuff is here, and it's part of nature. It's just part of the potential of all of our cells, that they can be read, that they can be potentially changed. And I don't think we're going to prevent people from doing that. I don't personally think it's a worthwhile use of our effort to try to prevent people from doing biotechnology. I think it's more worthwhile to invite them into understanding what are the complexities of it, what are the risks, and that we somehow build this future together and have a real conversation that's more educated around where it's all going.
Hola, ¿cómo estás? Me quedé pensando de dónde sacabas vos las muestras. Me impactó mucho todo el tema de que todos tenemos muestras en todos lados y no sabemos dónde está esa información, que en realidad es lo mismo que nos pasa con las redes sociales, lo mismo que nos pasa con un montón de cosas. Y me quedé pensando de dónde sacabas vos los materiales genéticos con los que trabajás. O sea, bueno, en el caso de Chelsea sí, obvio, es de ahí, pero si tenías donantes, si cómo era ese sistema, cómo manejabas eso.
So when I started Stranger Visions, it was a very experimental project, and when I first started to go into the lab with these samples, you know, I picked up cigarette butts and chewed up gum from the street. When I first started, I had this like map of New York City, and I went all around these different neighborhoods and gathered all these samples and went into the lab, and nothing worked. It was like a total fail. And I'd put all this time into going around the city and collecting samples. And so I had to go through many rounds of experiments before I actually started to get good DNA data from the forensic samples. And by the time I got to that point, basically I'd become very lazy. And so I would just walk from my apartment, get on the bus, go to the lab, and like pick up things along the way. And there's never any shortage. This is the thing with genetic samples. You know, there's no shortage of them, so you can always just walk down the street and pick stuff up. And so at that point, I was mostly picking things up basically along this route in Brooklyn from where I lived to the lab. Yeah.
Hola, muchas gracias y muy interesante la charla. ¿Trabajaste alguna vez con modificaciones en ADN que generen enfermedades, como por ejemplo desregulaciones de genes que dan cáncer o ese tipo de enfermedades?
I haven't, no. And that is something that I specifically avoided with Stranger Visions. Even though it's almost impossible that someone would walk into the gallery and see a depiction of themselves and and recognize, oh, I was there at that time in that place. It's not totally impossible, and so I purposefully didn't look at any kind of disease risks or things like that, and stuck to what are called externally visible characteristics. So generally looking at things that you might see in being in the room with someone. So for that project, I specifically didn't look at disease risks for that reason. And I have not gone much into that area. But I have been increasingly looking into behavioral prediction, which is a different kinds of things, but not so much like medical disease risk.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Quería hacerte una pregunta pensando en el tema de los prejuicios, los sesgos del que hablabas antes, pensando que todos somos prejuiciosos, que de hecho los prejuicios son casi básicos para que podamos caminar por la calle, y el peligro de tomar a los prejuicios como algo malo en sí, si eso no puede terminar siendo también desde el punto de vista artístico como un límite, ¿no?, que te lleve como un lugar de corrección política, ¿no?, a que la obra quede como con menos libertad para jugar, para animarse a lo que salga, por los peligros que hay con todo lo genético, ¿no?, todos los miedos que se generan a partir de qué puedo hacer con esto. Eso, si tiene algún problema con la libertad del artista o con la posibilidad de que sea incorrecto el artista también.
I'm just trying to think through what that means. Like that politically, I don't think I understood quite what would be the politically incorrect. What do you mean? Like that I would be afraid of stereotypes or something, or? I mean, maybe I guess I would respond to that by saying that I haven't felt any kind of, that my freedom is impinged on in that respect. So I think the work that I do, it challenges a lot of people, and it raises a lot of questions, and sometimes pisses people off. And so that's not like something that I worry about generally. Like playing it safe is not something that I worry about in my art practice. But I definitely don't want to hurt people. And so that's different. It's important to me that I would not be hurting people by like perpetrating stereotypes or something like that.
Hi there, I just have a quick question. I'm curious about the exhibit for the blood bank and the 7,000 blood vials, if those came from individuals and how that was acquired, and also what the QR codes led to.
It's fake blood, I'm sorry to say. I'm sorry to say. It's theatrical blood. And the QR codes don't lead to anything, although it would have been a great layer of the project. But I thought of the QR codes kind of at the last minute. It was this installation, it was really a logistical effort, pulling it off. And so the labels, we kind of ended up doing the labels very last minute in the project. But if I did it again, or if I get to stage the project again, I would love to have the QR codes actually lead to something, so you could have like an augmented layer of the project. I think that would be very interesting. And it would be interesting to have real blood in there as well. It would require making the room a lot colder than we were able to do in the Cooper Hewitt Museum, which is really this like 19th century historic building, and I mean it had so many limitations with doing this project. But probably it's a good question what blood I would use if we were able to use real blood. For example, would it be like animal blood? That would probably be the most obvious one to get blood like from the abattoir. But there could also be a potential there to do something with actually purchasing samples. This would be very interesting to do. It would just be a lot more expensive. So these kind of contingencies always come into play with the budget, and what you're allowed to do, what's possible, in the space, what's possible with the budget. Yeah, that's the sad truth.
Hola, muchas gracias por la presentación, me pareció muy interesante. Mi pregunta va más por un lado más de procesos, ¿no? Me interesó mucho que todas tus obras parecen tener sonido, aparte de una parte visual muy potente, el sonido parece que atraviesa las obras de una forma importante. Y me imagino que estar en el laboratorio analizando todas esas muestras, seguramente acompañada de algunos sonidos muy particulares, hace que haya una huella sonora en esas historias, digamos. ¿Cómo lo pensás al sonido? ¿Desde qué lugar lo pensás al sonido en tus obras?
Yeah, that's very observant, and yes, I have been interested in sound for decades, basically. So long before I got interested in bio stuff, I was interested in sound art and experimenting with sound and in algorithmic processes and things like that. So I would just say that I continue to be interested in using sound, music, in an art installation context to connect with people in different ways. Yeah.
Hola. Bien, mi consulta es al respecto de esto que vos recolectabas las muestras en el tránsito de tu casa al laboratorio. A mí me generaba como toda una pregunta al respecto de esas muestras, si vos podías hacer una lectura de esas predicciones del espacio, si había algo de lo regional o lo local que podías leer en esas muestras, si había una lectura más global que no sea la individual, ¿no?, de la zona. Y por otro lado, la otra pregunta que también me surgió en todo esto que vos presentaste es si esas muestras encontradas alguna vez vos tuviste la iniciativa o te surgió decir, tal vez esto es de esta persona que tengo al lado o me está acompañando, como una segunda predicción más intuitiva.
I don't think I know what the second intuitive prediction would be, but in terms of the distribution of the samples and kind of what they say about people in a locale, I think that one could absolutely do that and look into that more. There are genetic studies and there's been interesting studies of looking at the microbiome around New York City, so looking at like microbes in different parts of the city and how that relates to different demographics of people that live in different regions and things like that. So I think you could learn all kinds of interesting things if you had many, many, many more samples. Basically I was looking at like 7 people. So it's very, very few. And New York is a very global, very diverse place, very international place, and that's what makes it interesting. Also, that you get so much diversity, just on one block, basically, in New York, which is fantastic. But you would need a lot more samples, I think, to really get a sense of how are neighborhoods different from each other and things like that. But you could do that, if you had the time and the money and all of that to collect all those samples and look at them. You could learn all kinds of interesting things, I'm sure.
Llegamos al final. Muchas gracias, Heather. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming down. This is her first visit to South America, so we hope you have a productive interchange with all these beautiful artists and people interested in these subjects.